Hi, I'm Jim Riley, and welcome to Worse, Tales of Strength and Endurance from the Old Days. Times are tough, but we'll get through this. We've been through worse. Tonight on Worse, we're looking at No Parachute, New York in 1900, and Famous to Death. And while we're doing that, I'm going to be enjoying a Steel Reserve from the Steel Brewing Company, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and some turkey pepperoni. So, as we sit by the fire here, if you'd like to have something to eat, you might want to put this on pause for a moment, grab something to eat and drink, sit down, and we'll get started. All right. According to U.S. News, 6,000 Americans a year die from falls in their home. In fact, falling is the #1 cause of death from injury at home. Well, I've never tried skydiving, but my sister has. And I've never served in the military, but I have a cousin who did and received paratrooper training. So I'm thinking about, with all the people that can die from things like falling from standing to the floor, falling in the tub, and these are legitimate and serious injuries and concerns, how is it that every once in a while there is someone who falls from a plane when their parachute doesn't open? And in 1943, Alan McGee was serving in a bomber in the U.S. Army Air Corps. This was before there was an Air Force. And he was over France when he was the ball turret gunner. He was the person who was in that glass sphere that was on the underside of a bomber who would protect it with a machine gun from below. When the plane was badly damaged, in the course of this damage, his parachute pack was also damaged. He got out of his ball turret and he proceeded toward the bomb bay doors, waiting for presumably a replacement parachute and instructions from the captain to bail out. But then there was an explosion that blew him out of the plane. Now, there are varying accounts here where a newsletter printed in 1996 by the 303rd Bomb Group, of which Mr. McGee was a part, said that as he fell, he thought to himself, "I don't want to die because I know nothing of life." Other accounts indicate that the explosion knocked him unconscious as it blew him out of the plane. But the fact is, he fell 20,000 feet over the town of Saint-Nazaire in France. We would say Saint-Nazaire or Saint-Nazare, but they pronounce it Saint-Nazaire. Smashed through the glass roof of the train station and ended up dangling from a girder. He had badly damaged teeth, knees, ankles. His arm was almost torn off. The people who got to him were the Germans, because this is a part of France still occupied by the Germans at this time. And the doctor said, "We are enemies, but I am first a doctor, and I will do my best to save your arm," which he did do. Mr. McGee then spent time in various German hospitals and finally in a prisoner of war camp where he reports he was consistently treated well. And years later, he was able to go back to Saint-Nazaire, see where it all happened, and connect with some of the people who helped him. One of the things that, sort of apropos of nothing, as they say, is that at one point Mr. McGee worked in a Nabisco factory, and the plane that he flew in was named Snap, Crackle, and Pop. And gaudily painted on the side of the plane were the three iconic mascots of Rice Krispies, Snap, Crackle, and Pop, riding down on a bomb. I hope they had a better outcome than I hope they had as good an outcome as Mr. McGee did. So have you heard of Bear Grylls? He's a TV personality. In fact, TV Guide identifies his profession as survivalist, author, and reality cast member. He had a show called Man vs. Wild for a while. Okay, well, what I didn't know was that in 1996, he was serving in the SAS, which is the Special Forces of the British Army. And in a jump out of a plane, his chute didn't open. Now, I can only assume that the streamer of the unopened chute arrested his descent to some extent, because he hit the ground, had 3 fractured vertebrae, but didn't die. He had months of therapy, and about a year later, he summited Mount Everest. That sounds like somebody who deserves their own reality show. But what if you never had a parachute to begin with? So in 1944, back in World War II, another bomber crew member, this time in a British Lancaster bomber, a guy named Nicholas Alcamod, was in the plane when it was badly damaged. The captain gave the order to jump, but Alcamod's parachute had been destroyed. Before he could get a new one, the flames and smoke were approaching him, and he thought, well, I guess this is the end of it, and he jumped out of the plane. Somewhere on the way to the ground, he blacked out. He awakened in a snowdrift with a sprained ankle. He had a whistle with him, which he blew to summon help. Unfortunately, the people who heard the whistle were the Germans, who took him into captivity, and he was questioned by the Gestapo, who were extremely suspicious of his claim that he had come out of a plane because he had no parachute. Under the circumstances, I can understand their suspicion. However, amazingly, they chose to believe his story, and he went to Stalag Luft 3, a famous or infamous German prisoner of war camp, which was the setting of the movie The Great Escape. At any rate, he survived the war, married his sweetheart, and had a son. Julianne Kepke was flying in a plane over the Peruvian rainforest in 1971 when the plane exploded. She fell 19,000 feet, still strapped in her seat, crashed into the rainforest, and got deep cuts. Deep cuts after falling 19,000 feet? Okay. She was dressed in a dress. She survived 10 days in the jungle until she found some lumberjacks who helped to get her back to civilization. And years later, there was a photograph of her. Went back to the site of the crash and saw the remains of the plane, from which she was the only survivor. But if you want to look in the Guinness book and see who the altitude champ is for falling and not dying, it was Vesna Vulovic, who was a flight attendant on a Yugoslav air flight in 1972 when over the Czech Republic the plane exploded. Many of her fellow crew members were sucked out of the plane, but she was jammed in place by, I guess, a food cart or something. So she wasn't sucked out, and she fell in the fuselage 33,000 feet. She landed in trees and deep snow, which cushioned the landing. She was in a coma. She had broken legs, a lot of injuries, temporary paralysis, but fought her way back and went back to work for Yugoslav Air. They gave her a desk job. She actually wanted to go back as a flight attendant, and it's not clear whether she didn't go back as a flight attendant because of her injuries or whether she didn't go back because Yugoslav Air didn't want somebody walking up and down the aisle say, yeah, I was in a plane that blew up. Now, the New York Times had a story in 2016 where two Czech journalists looked into this, and they questioned the idea that she was at that altitude. The plane may have exploded at 3,000 feet, and it may have been shot down in error as opposed to having blown up for some other reason. But whether it was 3,000 or 33,000, I give her a heck of a lot of credit. So as we get older, falls are an increasing risk. So exercise and stretch to keep yourself strong and flexible. You never know how badly you might need it. Okay. Around the year 2000, New York Magazine put out a story called These Are the Good Old Days. And to underscore the idea, not everybody thought that New York was the most wonderful place to be in the year 2000. They had a picture from 1900 of a drug addict passed out on the street. And that underscores a very important point, that as bad as we think New York may be now, and it is currently experiencing, as much of the country, a spike in crime, there were some things that were really, really awful about how it was back at the turn of the last century. So in 1897, the 5 boroughs of New York came together as one city for the first time. Manhattan, Brooklyn, Queens, Staten Island, and the Bronx came together to become New York City. And in 1900, the tallest office building in New York City, and in fact in the world, was 391 feet tall. It was the Park Row building. Now, the reason I bring that up is that it helps to underscore why, if you look at old pictures of New York City, the crowds on the street look so dense. It's because there was less room for everybody. There weren't skyscrapers going up and up and up with all of that real estate and all of those apartments for everybody. People were crammed into smaller spaces. They lived in smaller spaces. The buildings were smaller. Just to give you an idea, the current population of Manhattan, the most densely populated borough of the city, the island that we all know of, is 1.6 million. That's 1.6 million in 23 square miles. I believe it's the most densely populated place in the United States. In 1900, it was 2.2 million. Before high rises, before vaccines, before the widespread use of deodorant. Good Lord. Corruption. There's an English political scientist named James Bryce who wrote in the late 1800s, and he said that the government of cities was the one conspicuous failure of democracy in America. He said the faults of the state governments were insignificant compared to the corruption of city governments. And New York City was, I think, the poster child even among city governments. You may have heard of Tammany Hall. That was an organization, this is really sick. Tammany, it was named after a Native American. But what it became was a center of political power in New York City, and in fact in the whole state of New York. It was mainly Irish run. Irish immigrants during the 19th century were pouring into New York City and constantly fueled a population to support Tammany Hall. It was infamous for kickbacks, corruption, bribery. There was a guy who was the head of Tammany Hall in 1900, and then 1900 was shortly after one of the waves of attempted reform that had little or no effect on the actual way that things were run. His name was Richard Croker, and he was later part of a collection of interviews that got published called A Series of Very Plain Talks on Very Practical Politics. This book is sort of a Machiavellian book for a later age. He wasn't advocating murder and killing your enemies and things like that, but it really was a very cynical look at how things are actually done. Looking back in 1900 at the attempted reforms that hadn't done much right before before the turn of the century, Crocker said, they tried to stand up so straight they fell over backwards. Good Lord. One of the things he pointed out was that Tammany Hall, and I am not a fan of Tammany Hall, was able to wield some of its power because they would be the first boots on the ground when a poor person needed help. He said, say a building burns down. We get in there fast, even before the aid societies, giving the people groceries, giving the people a place to stay temporarily. So who knows how many votes I get from a fire? That was the way he put it. He was proud of turning immigrants into citizens. Well, he didn't do it in a very disciplined way. Clean air. I don't know if you've ever seen the Martin Scorsese movie, The Age of Innocence. It takes place in the late 1800s in New York City. It was Daniel Day-Lewis, Michelle Pfeiffer. Some of the establishing shots, and I'm pretty sure that Scorsese is very good at getting these little textural details correct, was every building you could see had dark smoke pouring out of it. That's just the way it was. All these places burned coal. And that's the way that they did what they had to do, the way they kept the heat in. So it's ironic that there was an 1879 law that required each household, and this had not been the case previously, that each household in an apartment building had to have access to a narrow air shaft. In other words, even a little shaft going up to the roof where all that smoke was pouring out was an improvement over how it had been before. By 1900, 60,000 apartment buildings, or as we would call them, tenement buildings, had been built to this 1879 standard. And 1900 was just before a new law, called the New Law, was passed in 1901, saying that every room in an apartment had to have a window, and every apartment had to have its own bathroom. So I assume those 60,000 that got built before then were grandfathered in and didn't have to change. I doubt they were all torn down. But you can see relics of this in some of the plays that were written during the 20th century, where someone refers to living in a cold water flat, that is an apartment that only has cold water, not hot water, or doing dishes in the bathtub because there was literally no sink in the kitchen. Lighting. Millrose.com, which is a website run by a lighting contractor, it's actually some interesting information, said that well into the 20th century, gas lighting was the prevalent form of street lighting, which is, if you've ever seen it, you should know is pretty dim by modern standards. New York City had some of the first electrification in the country, and in 1880, they got some street lighting, but early lighting was arc lighting, which I don't know if you've ever seen it. It's not incandescent bulbs. It's something else that I don't know how to describe, but it's a very harsh, glaring light. It was set on tall towers that were intended to illuminate several blocks at once. People carried umbrellas to shield themselves, to shield their eyes from the glare. Can you imagine what it would have been like if your apartment was right next to one of these towers? Drug addiction. It's amazing to look at old photographs of medicine bottles from Friedrich Baer and Company, which is now the Baer Corporation, as in Baer aspirin. Heroin. Heroin was an over-the-counter alternative to morphine, advertised as being non-addictive. It was legal till several years into the 20th century. And Vice.com's website said that New York has always been the heroin capital of America. Narconon says that opium and morphine were already popular by 1900 for medicinal and recreational purposes. Morphine and opium were given for coughs, for sleeplessness. Moms gave it to fussy babies. Harper's Weekly called morphine the poor child's nurse. And America and New York was the heroin capital of America, and I presume the opioid capital of America. By 1900, 1 in 200 Americans were addicted to opiates. Males might smoke it in opium dens. Women were often prescribed it by male doctors for menstrual cramps and nervous disorders and ended up addicted. Sanitation. CollectorsWeekly.com, which I recommend you check out, said New York at the end of the 19th century is not uncommon for den animals to lie on the street for weeks. They had a photograph posted of some little kids playing with a decomposing horse just a few feet away from them. But actually, if you want to talk about 1900, the exact year, sanitation had become a bright spot because in this extremely imperfect reform that happened in the very late 1800s, one of the things that happened was that a Civil War veteran was put in charge of the sanitation department. He wouldn't do any patronage. He made people report in a military-style way up a chain of command, and they had an exact area of the city they needed to clean. They were responsible for it if it wasn't clean to standards. He made them wear white uniforms because they symbolized cleanliness, white helmets that were modeled after police helmets because they were to be seen as a form of authority. And when they first went into poor neighborhoods, sometimes the response was violent, and these sanitation workers had to have police protection because people didn't trust them. Within a few weeks, they were won over and they were regarded as heroes. They made an enormous difference in the city. So looking back, and I live not in New York City, but not far away, I reflect on how far we've come in terms of corruption. I've been building a house here for many years. I never paid a bribe. I was never asked for a bribe. Nobody ever implied that maybe I should give them a bribe. One of the things that I heard an immigrant say about America in the last 20, 25 years is there was a feeling when you came to America, you could see through the water. What a compliment. Let's keep it that way. Famous to death. I don't know if you ever heard of the poet Edna St. Vincent Millay, but she had a poem with a famous line, "My candle burns at both ends, it will not last the night, but ah, foes, and oh, my friends, it makes a lovely light." I think that describes some famous people. Burning the candle at both ends, they're not going to last, but it's like a car crash. We can't look away. We're mesmerized by the mess that they are. And it's not just their personal lives, and that's something I want to get to in a moment. The camera lens captures it, as do our brains. EverydayHealth.com had an article called Fame, Fortune, and Despair that talked about some of the work done by a British researcher named David Grylls. He wrote a book called Illusions of Immortality, The Psychology of Fame and Celebrity. And he said that fame validates the unique self. Now, a lot of the rest of us can validate our unique self through things like contributing to the world, participating fully in our families, having a network of friends. But if you have certain kinds of emotional neediness, that's not enough. And you may need, at the very least, your 15 minutes of fame, which is a phrase coined by the artist Andy Warhol back in the late 60s or early 70s, where he said that in the future, everybody will be famous for 15 minutes. This was before the internet. What a far-seeing guy. I think he was onto something. But if the ups and downs of fame long-term, or the feeling that you're going to lose it, is particularly stressful to you, it can cause a mood disorder, a major depressive disorder, or even suicide. I think of people that have gone through horrible things in the ups and downs of their fame. As a small example, Eric Clapton, the famous recording artist, he's been famous since the 60s. His most recent album, I Still Do, he recorded in long clothes head to foot and fingerless gloves because he had terrible eczema. And I know from family experience that eczema is associated with stress. There was a joke on the TV show The Simpsons where there was a show that was kind of like America's Got Talent or The Voice. And they said the 3 requirements for children who wanted to enter it were a beautiful singing voice, ruthless, pushy parents, and a gaping void in your self-esteem that can only be filled with applause. And as a performing artist, that's something that hit close enough to home that I laughed my head off when I heard that. Here's a famous person, Delores Hart. He was a lyricist of some famous musicals back in the 20s and 30s. High level of success. The life in terms of professionally that people could only dream of. But he ended up dying of exposure while he was drunk. This was in 1940. His writing partner, Richard Rodgers, had decided to revive an earlier hit of theirs and asked him to write some new stuff, which he was still able to do. But he wasn't sober very often, and it was pure luck that he was able to contribute to this revival of the musical at all. On the opening night of it, he turned up at the theater drunk, ill, and noisy. So one of their friends managed to get him home, but by the morning he was gone. It was terrible November weather. They couldn't find him. And that following night, a friend found him shivering in the gutter outside a bar on 8th Avenue. And nothing they could do at the hospital helped. Not the oxygen tent they gave him, not even penicillin. To give you an idea how well known he was, the president's wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, interceded with the War Production Board to procure a brand new miracle drug, penicillin, for him in an attempt to keep him alive, but it wasn't enough. He was dead of pneumonia. So whether this was a case of somebody who was died because of their fame or somebody who had a trajectory toward that, and perhaps it was merely interrupted by fame or amplified by fame, is hard to say. But there's certainly a lot of other people who have had what we would think of as everything somebody could want in life and still ended up having it be not enough. I wanted to look up how did Marilyn Monroe die. I didn't remember. I got as far as how did and Google finished the search for me. And the answer is self-administered overdose of barbiturates, which the coroner ruled a suicide. John Belushi died of an overdose. Chris Farley died of an overdose. You know, I've learned in the work I've done on television that the camera picks up incredible subtleties. And if we sense that someone is troubled, we watch them more closely. And a level behind our conscious awareness, we can tell there's something going on in there, and we want to see what's going to happen next. Laurence Olivier, the famous actor, actually directed Marilyn Monroe in a movie, and he said somewhere inside, she doesn't want to act, she wants to show herself. He said that while he was shooting her on a given day in this movie, it looked like she was doing nothing. He's like, she's the most boring person in the world. And then he would look the next day at what the camera had picked up, and he said, she's mesmerizing. Something strange about the camera that way. And unfortunately, it's something strange that can end up rewarding a troubled personality. But there's some people who've figured out how to do it right. The singer Bobby Sherman, who between 1962 and 1976 had 7 gold singles, 1 platinum single, 5 gold albums. My sister had his album when we were growing up. For the last 25 years, he has served as medical training officer at the Los Angeles Police Academy, teaching officers first aid and CPR. He and his wife have started the Bridget and Bobby Sherman Foundation to provide education and music instruction to children in Ghana. And then there's Delores Hart, who was a heartthrob actress in the late 50s, early 60s. She is the first actress that Elvis Presley ever kissed in a movie. In the later 60s, she became a nun. And in 2016, she celebrated 50 years in holy orders. So there is a way to make it work. So for the rest of us, I would say pray if you can, drink enough water, take deep breaths, and be grateful for what you have. Okay, and like and comment below. And I hope you'll join our free Facebook group, James Michael Riley Studios. Thanks so much for joining me tonight. And times are tough, but we'll get through this. We've been through worse. Good night.